o'clock, so we will start the webinar. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today. My name is Maurice Khadebe, Head and Director of Wits Business School. A big welcome to our guest speakers today. I would like to thank them for giving up their time to share their experience and insights into possible solutions to the current crisis we are experiencing in terms of a reliable, affordable energy supply across the continent, and I would dare say across the globe. We know that energy is such a critical part of everything that we do. You will also observe now that the standoff between EU and Russia is about now energy. The gas supplies into Europe has created a major crisis. So energy is at the center of everything that we do and the geopolitics around it. So it's important that we continuously, particularly as energy leaders, observe what's going on and continuously innovate, continuously debate and think through energy supply issues, particularly supply chain. And also we must continue to apply our mind in terms of how we're going to make this transition from high carbon economy to low carbon economy, because energy is at the center of the entire debate about climate change and sustainability. We need to focus on how we're ensuring that the energy transition is just, inclusive, and it ensures that nobody is left behind. So let me welcome our speakers. I would like to acknowledge particularly our government in South Africa, represented here by Mr. Jacob Mbele, the Deputy Director General for Energy Programs, EPP, at the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy in South Africa. Thank you, sir. We appreciate your coming and being with us in this international webinar. Let me also acknowledge and welcome Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper from Australia. Gabrielle is an energy sustainability and climate change professional from Australia's Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. She has spent 20 years, over 20 years, experience in corporate world, government, NGOs, and academia, and is an expert in distributed energy resources, which of course is a focus of today's webinar. We are also joined by Aradhana Pandarum, a senior researcher in the Energy Center of CSIR. She performs and manages research work related to the just energy transition. This is very much the focus of the African Energy Leadership Center here at Wits Business School. We're very passionate about that here at Business School, the whole just energy discussion, just energy transition, ensuring that just and fair energy distribution in Africa in particular, which creates opportunities in the energy industry and address socio-economic imbalances, is of utmost importance to our future sustainability. We also welcome Rentia van Tonder to this discussion. Rentia is with Standard Bank, and her focus is developing funding opportunities for the bank for the renewable power projects in South Africa and the rest of the continent. It is a privilege to be able to learn from specialized expertise and enormous experience of the three panelists today. We have a lot to go through, so I will hand over to my colleague, Dr. Lwazi Ngubevana, who is the director of the African Energy Leadership Center. Lwazi will moderate the discussion. Thank you very much. Over to you, Lwazi.
Thank you, Prof. Khadebe. As Prof. Khadebe said, my name is Lwazi. I will be your host for this afternoon. Our chat together shouldn't take much more than an hour, but we will try and get through as many of the critical issues on distributed energy resources as we can. We'll try and answer as many of your questions as we can. So as a matter of housekeeping, I would really like to just to ask everyone to keep their videos off, keep your mics off. You may turn them on when you need to speak, either when I call your name or after you have raised your hand. And the way we're going to run today is Dr. Kuiper will give us a short presentation, following which we will go into a panel session. I'll ask a few questions of the panelists, just touching on some critical issues. And then once we are done with that, we'll then open the floor up for questions. However, I want to encourage you to please type your questions in the chat as we go along. If there's anything that perhaps is coming from the presentation or, or from the discussion with the panelists, please type in your questions. We will begin with answering those questions. And then following which, if you have any follow-ups, you may then raise your hand. I will call you out, and then you can ask your question. And yeah, I think that is clear enough. And without much further ado, I would really like to call up on Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper to please take us through her work. It truly is a great honor and a privilege for us to have you address us today. Over to you, Gabrielle.
Well, likewise, thank you very much to both professors, to Wits Business School and to the African Energy Leadership Centre. It's a great pleasure and a delight to be speaking with you all today from Sydney, Australia. As has been mentioned, I'm going to talk about distributed energy resources. And if that term's not familiar to you, that encompasses a whole range of technologies, hardware and software, from rooftop solar through to battery storage, electric vehicles, and smart appliances. So generally, we're talking about hardware or software that's behind the meter or in the distribution network itself. Before I get into talking about DER in the Australian context, I thought it might be useful just to have one slide to introduce you to Australia's national electricity market. We call it a national electricity market. It only goes to the east coast of Australia, and I'll come back to the west coast right at the very end of the presentation. But it's a very large interconnected network. And as I go through the presentation, I'll focus on talking about the diagrams. The one you see on the left here is the grid as it exists now, and also the plans for large-scale transmission and new renewable energy zones. And there's been a big focus on growing large wind and solar resources, and that's the plan on the left. On the right is the details of the market as it currently exists. So it's an energy-only market. There is discussion about whether or not we need a capacity mechanism. The vast majority of stakeholders think we don't. One of the most extraordinary things that's happening with all the changes in the energy market in Australia over the last few years, particularly with the increased proportion of variable renewable energy, has been increased negative prices. So our price floor is at negative $1,000 per megawatt hour. And the graph you can see at the bottom there shows the increasing negative price periods over time. Now, obviously, that is particularly financially painful for coal generators that need to pay essentially to stay online. Oh, go back one. I've gone too far, sorry. Oh, and now I need to go back in. Sorry, don't know how that came out. So next slide. The graphs here, top left-hand side, you can see that this is not taking into account any behind the meter resources, but across that national electricity market, we've seen an increase in the proportion of renewable energy on average from about 20% to 30%. So we've got a long way to go in our national electricity market to get to 100%, but it's trending in the right direction. And what's been really significant has been the growth in rooftop solar. So we've got over 3 million households now with rooftop solar. That's about 30% of the housing stock. In some suburbs in Australia, you've got 100% of homes with rooftop solar, particularly in new areas, but also in a lot of regional and rural areas. You've got really high percentages, 60, 70, 80% of households that have got solar on the roof. And what's really important with the discussion about a just energy transition is to note that in the Australian context, this hasn't been the wealthiest houses and households that have been putting solar on the roof. This has been homes in lower socioeconomic status, outer suburban and regional areas where people have been particularly concerned about rising electricity prices. Now, obviously, there is a cost, but there are two things to note there. One, we've had increasing numbers of financial lenders that'll do essentially a buy now, pay later loan. So there's zero upfront cost. And also the payback period has fallen so far in Australia that you're looking at 3 or 4 years as the payback period for a rooftop solar system. Obviously, there are households that can't afford solar, but there have been some government programs, particularly to support solar on social housing. Here are two of my favourite graphs. First one is one from an IEEFA report where we looked at how South Australia, not South Africa, close but different, has transitioned from an extraordinary 0% renewable energy 14 years ago to 60% in 2020. It was 64% last year. And basically all coal has now exited that system. It's one of the largest jurisdictions in the world that's operating on a very high percentage of variable renewable energy. And I wanted to show you what that looked like for any energy nerds. This is a graph I took from an amazing website where you can see all of the data nearly on a real-time basis. The yellow triangles there are solar and the green is wind, and the line at the bottom is actually minimum demand in South Australia. So you can see that in the middle of the day, often, and this is not an extraordinary week, I just took last week, often South Australia is now exporting wind and solar to the state of Victoria next door where there's a transmission line. So the progress there has been really extraordinary. Oh, I've got to learn how to go forward. To give you another graphical example of that across the entire national electricity market, what you see there is really the massive growth in distributed PV. So the last 2 years, we've seen 3 gigawatts per year of rooftop solar added to the system. Now, that's a lot of households, but what we've seen increasingly in the last few years is commercial and industrial businesses. So Australia Post, IKEA, a lot of businesses that are obviously committing to net zero are putting solar on their facilities. The payback periods are there as they are for households. Plus, in the case of a lot of commercial and industrial facilities, it dramatically lowers their demand tariffs. And we had a world record in South Australia in October 2020, where for an entire hour, the whole state was powered by solar, both rooftop solar and a bit of utility scale solar. But what's fascinating is we're now seeing the rooftop solar eating utility solar's lunch. So that is fascinating because what we're seeing is these consumer-owned resources are competing with large utility facilities. What I'll get onto is how we can make the most of that consumer investment. So that's sort of the background context about where we're at the moment in Australia. But I was asked to talk about how do you manage all of this integration, not only of rooftop solar, but other kinds of distributed energy resources. And that is a large topic, but I think it can be narrowed down to 3 different types of action that need to be taken. And first and foremost is getting the technical standards and the technical integration right. Just to give one example of that, we've had a challenge with the installation of a lot of solar inverters that haven't had voltage disturbance ride through. Apologies if that's technical for anyone, but that just means that when there's a grid disturbance, the inverter actually shuts down and that solar stops being exported to the grid. And that can cause some significant disruption to the grid once you have enough rooftop solar systems on the grid. That problem's been fixed, but it really highlighted to everyone in Australia the importance of getting those technical standards right and trying to think about what technical standards are needed before you have the large growth, whether it's in rooftop solar or in electric vehicles into the future. There are regulatory and planning challenges that is, what do rules particularly to the distribution networks operate under? And we had a fantastic rule change last year where we actually gave distribution networks or distribution network businesses the responsibility for integrating distributed energy resources. When we wrote the rules for our national electricity market, rooftop solar was prohibitively expensive, and we weren't even thinking forward to what might happen with behind the meter resources. So it was only last year that regulatory change was made. And then what I'll get to is market and business model changes and what needs to be done there. So just a little bit more on this technical integration, because I think it's so important. And when rooftop solar started to be installed at scale, there was a lot of concerns around the challenges it might cause on the network. If rooftop solar is exporting to the grid, then you might expect to see some voltage rise. And there was a lot of concern that the voltage rises would get out of control, that it would be very difficult for the distribution networks to manage. Turns out, in fact, that voltages were extraordinarily high in the distribution networks anyway. That was a legacy issue from going from 240 to 230 volts and that transition not being complete. And also from an air conditioning boom we had in the 1990s and 2000s, particularly with households putting in ducted air conditioning. So the distribution network businesses were running the voltages high to ensure there was sufficient supply. The graph up the top here shows you what happens when, in fact, the high voltage in the network is affecting the PV system. And there are a few places where that's been an issue, but it's only 1 or 2% of customers. So what do you need, putting aside the scaremongering that happened, what do you actually need for technical integration within distribution network operations? I think there are a couple of things that are crucial, and obviously having visibility of now these multi-way flows within the network is vital. And you need communication and operability standards and protocols to assist with that. My favourite example of innovation within the Australian distribution network businesses is this idea of dynamic operating envelopes or dynamic connection agreements. So traditionally, if you've put a solar system on the roof, you might be able to export up to 5 kilowatts from that system into the grid. That's a fixed connection, if you like. What particularly the very smart engineers at our South Australian power networks considered was, what if you could change that limit dynamically so that that solar could export more at times where there was fewer constraints on the network, and you could dial back the exports when the system was constrained, which in the South Australian case is particularly on mild spring days where you've got very low demand and very high solar exports. So these are now being put in place. They're set in the South Australian case 5 minutes in advance. Queensland's doing it 1 minute and 1 minute intervals, and they're both 24 hours in advance on a rolling basis. Now, this is a significant change, but it's not costly. And one of the really good news stories I wanted to talk about tonight is the fact that while people were concerned that incorporating so much solar into the system was going to be very costly, so far, the experience in Australia is that it's actually been extraordinarily cheap. So South Australian power networks are spending less than 1% of their revenue currently to do this work on dynamic operating envelopes and associated increased network visibility. So from the good news story of dynamic operating envelopes, the key is that not only do they change dynamically, but they've been able to increase from a static limit of 5 kilowatts up to a dynamic limit of 10 kilowatts. And when this was first proposed, I thought it was fantastic. I thought, given that there was concerns about the congestion on the network, maybe we were looking at seeing consumers being able to export up to that 10 kilowatt limit 60, 70, 80% of the time. South Australian power networks have recently released modelling, and they're showing with their modelling, we'll wait and see how it plays out in real life, but the modelling is showing that consumers will be able to export up to that 10 kilowatt limit 98% of the year. So it's only about 50 hours a year during the daytime that those exports will be constrained. So dynamic operating envelopes, I think, are a fantastic tool. It gives the opportunity for greater exports and therefore greater revenue for the consumers that have solar. And it respects the constraints that may exist in the distribution network on a dynamic basis. From a good news story to things we're not so ahead on, we finally only got a wholesale demand response mechanism in October last year. And at the moment, it's only for large commercial and industrial loads. There is some trials of aggregated household demand response, but we're really behind on that, especially compared to jurisdictions like California. What is coming and what is another interesting technical challenge is what happens when demand gets incredibly low. We had an instance recently in South Australia where for the entire state, best part of 2 million people, the net demand was 108 megawatts. And obviously for a grid operator, that can be very challenging. Fortunately, now there have been a couple of synchronous condensers installed in South Australia, and AEMO, our system operator, have been finding the system easy to manage, but they are also looking at a way of managing minimum system load, which I can go into more. Right, virtual power plants. So I'm not sure if everyone on the call is familiar with this term. What it means is when you aggregate all of those distributed energy resources that I discussed at the beginning, and you use smart software essentially to be able to optimize their use behind the meter and decide when to export collectively to be able to participate, particularly in wholesale markets and in markets for grid services, what we call frequency control and ancillary services. So this is the market operator's diagram of a virtual power plant. And it's important to say that virtual power plants are not necessarily just on the supply side, but they can include demand side resources. So air conditioners that can be turned down, for example, that demand can be aggregated potentially to participate in a demand response market. So our market operator, the Australian Energy Market Operator, ran some trials, particularly in South Australia. And I wrote a report that started out looking at these trials because I wanted to find out what we'd learned. And the diagram and the table here show that really revenue was highly dependent on events, particularly in the case of South Australia. It can be islanded from the rest of the grid currently because it only has a connection through to Victoria. There's an interconnector also being constructed through to New South Wales. But if the interconnector to Victoria is down, the system is islanded, and there's often a significant need for those frequency control and ancillary services. And so all of these revenues and the bars there show you when that happened and there was a need for services. You can see there was only one participant in these trials that made significant revenue. And when you total all of this up, the revenue was relatively small in comparison to what it cost in R&D funding to run the trials, which was about $7 million. But as the next slide shows, it was a worthwhile investment because the trials did show that when you aggregated all of these devices, and I should clarify, in this case, it was all household batteries that were coupled with rooftop solar systems. Many of the households participating in the trials had got subsidised batteries through state government battery subsidies, as well as potentially being paid through the trial process. So the trial showed they could provide the grid services, energy, and assist with minimum system load. There were particularly some forecasting challenges, and there were some issues with communication dropouts because this was relying on household Wi-Fi. I think that's probably all to say about the trials, except that I started looking at these trials as a way of understanding what was happening with the first experiments in virtual power plants. And then I discovered there were actually 20 commercially available virtual power plant products. So either if you buy a battery or if you've already got a battery and you want to participate in a virtual power plant, there's about 20 different providers available to you. Now, at the moment, this is what the costs and the revenue look like for that provider. So there are high costs, obviously, in setting up the software to start off with. So if you're trying to optimize what's the best use, in this case, of a battery behind the meter versus wholesale market arbitrage, for example, versus playing in these frequency control and ancillary services markets, that's a complex piece of software that you're designing. There are also significant costs in acquiring customers because this is a new product for consumers. And at the moment, as you saw from the previous slide, there's not really a lot of revenue there. However, there is possible revenue into the future. So not only are we getting a fast frequency response market, but there's also the potential for these virtual power plants to provide regulation, frequency control and ancillary services. The trials were for contingency, which is sort of automated frequency control and ancillary services. I mentioned our wholesale demand response mechanism. If that was opened up to aggregated household demand response, that would provide another revenue stream. So there's a variety of possible revenue streams into the future. And my analysis for the report suggested that what we have here is very thin margins. So to make that more tangible, if you're a consumer, you're being paid perhaps $200 a year to have your battery available whenever the aggregator wants to access it to play in any of these external markets. However, if the margins are that thin, why are there so many providers entering this space? And my conclusion was that they see the future opportunities. So that's both on the revenue side that I've already outlined, but also on the capacity side. So with household batteries and rooftop solar systems, you're looking at a really relatively small capacity of storage. So often these household batteries are full by 11 o'clock in the morning. There's been so much sunshine that all the storage is taken up. As soon as you introduce electric vehicles, you're looking at batteries on wheels that have 6 to 10 times the capacity of a household solar system. And that's really going to dramatically change the revenue that you'll be able to store in that battery. And if consumers are comfortable with it, the revenue that they'll be able to make by providing their vehicle available to third parties to use to participate in these markets. And so there are complex financial dynamics, but what was fascinating was I came to this conclusion and the following conclusion, which was that as we get more rooftop solar, as we get more electric vehicles, potentially more demand responsive appliances, obviously the sales from the grid are going to decrease. Now, traditionally in Australia, we've had gentailers. This is companies that own particularly large coal-fired power stations, but also some gas ones. And then they've sold a retail product to consumers. So they've managed their risk and also earned revenue from the generation and coupled that with the retailing. My argument is that in future, the smart retailers will need to become VPP tailors unless they have access to this kind of behind the meter fleet of resources. There'll be a limited amount or reducing amount that they can trade through the grid. I came to this conclusion, and then the following week, one of our big 3 gentailers announced that they were going to expand their in-house virtual power plant from 205 megawatts to, and that should say 2,000 megawatts, forgotten a zero, apologies there, within 4 years. So that was fascinating. I wished I'd put my report out the week before and it would have looked like I'd had a crystal ball. But in effect, it endorsed my thesis particularly because the CEO, when he announced it, said, we can do this very fast and very cheaply. And he meant in particular in comparison to building large scale generation. So for example, as part of this 2 gigawatts of virtual power plant by 2026, they're going to have, planning on having 5,000 electric vehicles under management. So the dynamics of this are changing very fast and it's fascinating. I promised that right at the end, I would talk about Western Australia, the other side of the grid. So this is a very different system. It's isolated from the rest of the country. But I wanted to raise it particularly because it shows another way in which distributed energy resources can be useful. And that's because they help make it possible to have much cheaper and more resilient standalone power systems and microgrids. So Western Power, which covered all the area in grey that you see on the map here, they've analysed their network and they realised that 60% of their network was connecting about 10% of their customer base. And they realised that having all of those poles and wires going over very long distances was no longer economic. So they've, I think, done the most forward-thinking plan of any distribution business I've seen anywhere in the world. And they've said, we're going to have underground in Perth and the high density areas. We're going to go above ground in suburban settings. And then we're going to do these standalone power systems and microgrids in these low density areas, essentially out in the desert. And they are pulling down poles and wires that go to those communities because they're so confident, particularly that the combination of rooftop solar and battery storage will give the quality of supply and the resilience needed in those communities. Some of you may have seen the coverage of the floods in Australia over the last week or so. We also had a very bad bushfire summer a couple of years ago, climate change is here and very prominent in the Australian experience. And what we've learned from that is also that these distributed energy resources can provide greater resilience, especially when the poles and wires go down. Behind the meter resources are very important. So to sum up where we're at with DER integration in Australia, very important to note that from our experience, technical integration needs to come first. My favourite innovation are these dynamic operating envelopes. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. I think electric vehicles will change everything. I also work with colleagues in India. India is fascinating because EVs are coming in thick and fast there, and they're being powered by rooftop solar systems, which are going in to support them. And as I've said, I have a whole 37-page report for anyone that wants to read it about virtual power plants, arguing that aggregated DER is the future of retailing in the Australian context. And most importantly, in a changing climate, these distributed energy resources provide opportunities for greater resilience. So that's an overview of DER in Australia. I really look forward to the panelists' comments and to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. That was really enlightening. I think there's a great many lessons for South Africa from your experience. You know, today's conversation is happening on exactly the first day of yet another price increase in electricity prices. And this is very uncomfortable for a lot of people in South Africa. I think, you know, the consumers are really buckling under the pressure of high electricity prices. We've got winter coming up. And of course, in the South African experience, we know that what that means, and that means power cuts. We've euphemistically called them load shedding, but quite frankly, these are rolling blackouts. Now, I want to get into the panel session. So what I will do, I will not introduce the panelists. Prof. Khadeb has really done that already. So I'll really just get straight to the questions. I do have a couple of questions. You know, looking at this presentation, it really got me thinking. I mean, 15, 20 gigawatts onto the South African grid, the power grid. What a difference that would make. You know, that's more than 40% of Eskom's current fleet. That would absolutely change the game. And first up, I really want to ask Mr. Mbele, you know, for me, it's easy as an academic and as a member of the public to point fingers at government and say, it's your fault, you are not acting. Where's the inertia? What's happening? Is it policy? Is it regulation? Or are we, you know, perhaps don't have the political will because we're protecting the incumbent? What is it? Please enlighten us.
Thanks, Prof, for the question, and thank you to Dr. Kuiper. Let me put my video on for a very enlightening presentation. Prof, I'll first start by saying when it comes to DER, I think because of the challenges that you mentioned that we are facing here in South Africa, it is happening. And from a government point of view, there has been a number of regulatory changes to give some traction to some of these changes. Some of it may be seen not to be sufficient, but I think some of the challenges that Dr. Kuiper presented are a consideration in some of the policy decisions or the regulatory decisions that are made. I think to give one specific example, I think if I hone in on the issue of technical integration, I mean, if you look at our distribution system where these DRs will generally come in, you'll understand that you know, it's not everywhere in the country where you'll be able to pull off these or these DRs at the scale that Australia has been able to do that. We obviously need to focus on getting our distribution networks technically or infrastructure-wise to perform and operate at the right level. We obviously need correct skills to be able to manage the systems in some of our municipalities. So, I mean, the long short of it is that it's not necessarily that there is no traction. I think it is because of the base that we're starting at. I mean, there are some of the distributors like the City of Cape Town that are almost advanced in terms of what they are doing in enabling DR within their licensed areas. And similarly, ESCOM in some areas, they are looking at this. So there is some movement, but I think this movement is also influenced by the base and some of the integration issues that were shared, or the challenges or limitations that were shared earlier. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mbele. You know, you mentioned something quite important, and that is the skills deficit. And I want to call up Aradhna. Aradhna, you've worked at ESCOM. You're a researcher at the CSIR. Where do you see the skills gap? And over and above the skills gap, do you think we've got the technical expertise to roll this out on a large scale? Do we have the technologies to do this? And if not, can we reasonably import the technologies and the skills to do this?
Yeah, so in terms of the skills, I would actually say that for the implementation or construction of these systems, we do have some skills in South Africa for solar PV and battery storage systems. The value chain requires system design, project development, and installation, as well as operations and maintenance. However, I foresee for the longer term adoption of DR, I think we will definitely need more skills to be developed. We note that the college education in terms of what is available at the moment are actually lacking practical skills as well as specialized focus on these specific areas, which is quite scary because if we are moving towards the just energy transition, this needs to change. Especially in communities that are actually most affected by the transition. Some generic professions and skills can actually be transferred in terms of, you know, the white collar skills that exist and the professions that exist. You can really transfer them into the value chains for these specific technologies. But I would think that we are in need to actually reboot the curriculums that we currently have, especially as I mentioned in the core regions, because there needs to be a rethink in terms of what those curriculums need to entail. I've heard the previous term in terms of being skilled is that people are, some of the youth is actually being skilled to joblessness, and this came from a CETA. So I think we really need to think broadly in terms of that. There's also talk about, you know, if you're increasing this DER to such an extent, you obviously need to look at the other value chains in terms of, you know, the production of equipment or localization of that. I think that area is seriously lacking. We've, you know, gotten to the stage of identifying that it needs to happen in terms of manufacturing, but we haven't really proven feasibility. There's no numbers out there. And I think in terms of that, we really need to look at the country and see how we actually, you know, upgrade the skills in terms of that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And this leads me, I think, nicely to my next question. And this is for Rentia. You are involved in energy financing. How are we going to finance a massive rollout of DER? Do we have creative solutions, funding solutions in place? And this includes funding for skills development. What's your take on that?
Thanks, Lwazi, and thanks for the presentation. It was very informative. I think it's a very valid question, and the one thing I can say to you in terms of the response to Jacob and the comments, this is a partnership. I mean, we have to work together with government, with developers, with solution providers to be able to fast track this. And from a funding perspective, we've been quite closely involved with our clients. We've been in discussion with the government, with NERSA, and with solution providers. And I think one cannot ignore the importance of access to finance. I think the simple answer is that banks have been quite flexible in terms of finding solutions. We've got a whole host of solutions. So, for example, we look at asset finance for small-scale solutions. We may have a client that want to do a rooftop rollout, and that we can do on a quick asset finance basis. We do have the more complex finance solutions, which is normally with some of the requests for proposals that's currently out from mining companies, where they look at 80 megawatt, even up to 300 megawatts of captive power that they want to procure through a PPA solution. So we have structures where we've worked with our clients to be able to provide that. We've also, about 6 months ago, launched a new business, which is a platform business called Power Pulse, where we link up with our clients to provide them with access to different EPCs and solution providers in a platform environment. So the bank then facilitates these introductions. We assist our clients to be able to make contact with different solution providers. We provide a concierge service in evaluating that and then proposing on the back of that also a finance solution. So there's a lot of flexibility around it. I think the other point that I just want to make is around linking that into local value chains and having the ability to capitalize on the broader localization objective of the country, which is also something that we started to do through some of our initiatives, to make contact with the different solution providers and the equipment suppliers and see if there's not benefit in bulk procurement, linking that to, for example, a Power Pulse platform. So there's a number of touch points. I do think where we do have a lack of finance and certainly need to do more is especially on the equity side, where you have, for example, a SPV structure with a project finance debt tranche linking into that, selling power under that arrangement, under PPA arrangement to the off-taker. And you normally require, through the RFPs, many of the companies would like to see BE involvement, community involvement. And what we do see is that there's sometimes a lack of access to finance to be able to support, these different levels of participation in the equity side. And I think, I've been a great supporter of finding structures, working together with DFIs to be able to unlock that. So I do think that's potentially an opportunity to take forward. Thank you, Lwazi.
Thank you so much, Rentia. Gabrielle, I'm head back to you. If you had to advise South Africa, what's the one thing you'd say as a pitfall, we need to look out for? What's the one thing we need to avoid?
I think it is the technical scaremongering about the problems that distributed energy resources will cause on the system. Despite the fact that we've got very modern networks, a lot of people were saying we're going to have brownouts, we're going to have blackouts, or the networks won't possibly cope with all of this solar on the system. Reverse flows through substations, and that's going to cause chaos. And yes, we have a lot of reverse flows through a lot of substations now. There is solar feeding back up into the transmission grid in some places, but the distribution businesses have changed transformer taps for those engineers that want to know about those things. And essentially the engineers have found solutions. So I'd suggest don't be afraid of the technical challenges, because they can be overcome, and instead see the opportunities here. And I think to the point about, that was mentioned about the cost of all of this and the equity considerations, that's why I really wanted to mention Western Power at the end, because they're showing how you actually get a cheaper supply, particularly to remote and regional customers, by providing this combination of standalone power systems and microgrids than a traditional sort of poles and wires infrastructure.
No, thank you for that. And certainly technical scaremongering has been a big issue, I think, in South Africa, just from my observations. There's been a lot of talk around that, that we're going to cause grid instability and so forth. Speaking of which, Aradhana, do you think we've got all the essential technical specifications in place for us to move forward? And in addition, who do you think should be taking up the role, at least the lead in developing the expertise in the country? Is it the private sector's responsibility because they need the business, or should it be government that's spearheading this? Or do you perhaps see a PPP kind of arrangement? Who do you think should be spearheading this?
In terms of technical infrastructure, so this is obviously referring to the grid infrastructure and the capacity that we have available. So we are already aware that Eskom is experiencing challenges in terms of the medium voltage and high voltage grids and in the Northern Cape. And even though there's a plan in place to actually upgrade and reinforce these networks, this is going to hinder on the growth of DER. When at Eskom, I actually saw that this problem was already starting in the Northern Cape, where some of the small scale and better generation installations and applications would maybe not be approved in terms of getting them installed on the grid and accepted to be installed. And then in terms of the smaller to medium scale systems, I actually definitely foresee the challenges that Dr. Kuiper has alluded to. Because looking at research, it was found, you get the voltage impacts as well as the thermal loading impacts. However, there's mitigation measures that have been identified. And funny enough, I've done a lot of the research from the Australian papers that I've seen in terms of these mitigation measures. And there are solutions. There are even solutions where this doesn't even require capital investments from the utilities or the network service providers. And this refers to, I think there was one question on smart inverters. But our guidelines in terms of the NRA standards that we currently have in place, these are not equipped as yet to allow for these solutions, let alone, the added solutions in terms of what is expected in the future. But I think one of the major challenges that we're actually facing is the visibility on our networks, especially the low voltage networks, as well as the need for the smart infrastructure that we require. And the question with South Africa is it's a little different to Australia in terms of where the capital is going to come from. Who's going to invest in this? And, does the customer pay, and to what extent? And, when you're adding these customers, how do you actually deal with that in a just way? Because that's now another issue that we actually need to talk about. And then the second point that you've mentioned in terms of the skills and development of this, I think industry does play a large role in terms of adding to these skills and helping this energy transition along, because at the end of the day it's also suiting them as companies in terms of their sustainability. But I also see there can be a need for, or there can be an opportunity for PPPs. And, you know, now we do talk about the virtual power plants. You could also even talk about community shares models, that business models that, you know, Dr. Kuiper had mentioned as well, that could include these PPP models that could actually enhance the installation of DERs, and, you know, in different senses, because it just depends on the problem that you're trying to solve. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Aradhna. You did touch on a number of issues. Something I want to throw back at Rentia, you talked about, you know, while we were discussing financing, is the targeted finance in South Africa looking at marginalized groups, you know, youth, women, and the like?
I think, Luwazi, to be absolutely honest with you, from what I can see, not necessarily. I think the request for proposals that we do see provide some guidance and requirements under those processes for inclusion of different types of, you know, groups, including communities, etc. We've seen it working quite well in the renewable energy program run by the IPP office, where there's very clear thresholds in terms of these requirements, and the projects then go out and raise finance. In most cases, there's not specific targeted finance institutions focusing on that, but I do think there has been progress made, especially on the larger program, in terms of DFIs structuring solutions around that. I think if you look at these smaller type projects, it's not always the intent in terms of the RFPs that we see, that it is so specific in terms of requirements. And maybe that is the next step. You know, it must filter through to these companies who are purchasing the power to be able to report into their not only ESG, but development commitments in terms of their scorecard to government, to include that there. And that will definitely stimulate more of a proactive approach towards the financing of that, as we've seen in REAP.
Thank you so much. I think my last question I want to throw at Mr. Mbele. If by some miracle we woke up tomorrow and we had this pot of gold that we could finance a massive DR program, what impact do you think that would have, and how? And also, do you think that would change the, let's call it, the direction of where our national electricity utility is going? And that's ESCOM.
No, Prof, I think if that miracle happened tomorrow, I think we'll all be happy, because the reality is that we, as you correctly indicated earlier, we're experiencing rolling, obviously, load shedding, and any additional power to the grid will go a long way in making sure that we balance supply and demand. It is also our belief, by the way, that in the short term, solutions to our problem will come from distributed resources, because they can be deployed at speed. So obviously that would be welcome. I think in terms of our various utilities, it will just mean that they have to adapt their business models, you know, and take advantage of this opportunity. I mean, some of the discussions that are already happening at local government level, specifically around municipalities, is how municipalities can repurpose themselves and use the already existing infrastructure, such as cables and lines, to, you know, to allow for trading of electricity within their space, and therefore in revenue, you know. So effectively, if that happened, it will obviously go a long way in assisting with our supply side challenges, but in terms of utilities, it will also create a new path for revenue generation in that space. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I think as a parting shot, I would like to give Dr. Kuiper one last word, and then we'll quickly get to the audience question. You know, in South Africa, we are still battling to define what a just energy transition would look like for us as a country. And I'm thinking here in particular, you know, our mining communities, coal mining communities that are going to be impacted by this transition. Do you think there's anything that we can learn from your experience on how we should transition? You know, you showed us, for example, how I think it was South Australia moved to zero coal. What happened to those communities that relied, you know, on the coal industry? And is there anything we can take from that to help South Africa transition?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it'd probably be a bit impertinent for me to provide advice in the sense that Australia's coal communities, while some of them are in lower socioeconomic areas, obviously the economic conditions here are so different and it varies. However, I will recommend that people look at what's being done in the Latrobe Valley, which is a region of the state of Victoria, which is low socioeconomic status and has had a high dependency on coal exports. And they actually set up a Latrobe Valley Authority to take the community through this transition. So I think a special purpose government agency like that, in this case, has been highly useful and successful. And the other thing I'd say is, while there's a lot of recognition of the difficulty, particularly for people who have relatively unskilled backgrounds who are currently earning relatively high salaries in the export coal industry in Australia, there's now recognition that the transition is inevitable. And what has been amazing is also the job creation that renewables provides. And there was a comment earlier about the fact that you can get faster, cheaper, essentially decarbonisation with DER. The other thing that obviously all of these distributed resources give you is the opportunity for huge amounts of job creation, whether that's installing rooftop solar in future, you know, selling electric scooters or three-wheelers, the opportunities for more efficient or demand responsive appliances, whether behind the meter, whether that's in homes or in commercial and industrial facilities. You know, once you've building a large solar or wind farm is not different to building any large piece of infrastructure. And a lot of that is now automated. There are very few jobs, relatively speaking, involved, whereas distributed energy resources provide the opportunity for a lot of local jobs, as one of my colleagues like to say. While, you know, the solar panel might have been manufactured in Beijing, you can't install it in Australia from Beijing. So, you know, there are all of those opportunities on the ground for installation. And some of those, you know, you need to have a lot of support for the skills development and the accreditation of those professionals and the like. But some of that can be built up relatively quickly.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. I really do like the idea of a specialized agency that is going to look at how we transition. I think this is something that South Africa needs to set up properly. Yes, we do have, you know, like the PCC, for example, but I think we do need to focus on the transition and bring those communities into the conversation. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly go through a few of our audience questions. And I will see, I think the first question is from Mike Barker. I think right now you started answering this one. It says, without energy flexibility, grid entitled buildings and the IE 1547 family of smart inverters, the grid won't cope with more than 80% RE. Now, the question is, why has there been no interest in the IEEE family of tech standards?
Actually, there is. So we've just recently had an NRS 097-2-3 working group meeting, which is for simplified connection criteria for embedded generation. And at that meeting, the mitigation measures that I've mentioned, including the smart inverters, were spoken of. This needs to filter into the NRS 097-2-1 guideline. And I think that is where the delay is. It's also, it's not as simple as just, having one voltage slash watt kind of curve, a volt watt curve and a volt var curve. It needs to be considered in terms of the situations and the actual installations that are required to be added to the grid. So it is happening. People are thinking about it. The right people are thinking about it. I think it's just not happening fast enough, and that's the problem. There's other issues linked to that as well, because we have inverters from 2003 that obviously don't even have that functionality. So, us thinking about what do you do in a just sense to, the people that are adding inverters to those networks that have the old inverters. So there's a lot of issues to think about it, but I think we are getting there, but a little slowly.
All right, no, understood. Thank you so much. Renchi, I think this one is for you. It's a comment slash question from Sunny Morgan. And the question is, well, the comment first is, community-owned renewable energy projects. It's not like the REI PPP, and so we can't apply the same credit policies. So the question is there alternative funding models or mechanisms available, to progressive project developers?
I think it's a very valid question, and to be quite open about it. Yes, I think there's certainly ways and means that one can look at it differently, but at the end of the day, I mean, offtake risk remains with how do you interpret your payment obligations under your PPA, or if it's directly on the balance sheet of the entity buying the power, that is the case. I think in the case of community projects, the bigger challenge is around how do you ensure that you look at this with a development hat on in terms of the payment, and how do you partner with the right players. So we've done in my previous life at IDC quite a lot of work around models to be able to assist in developing projects with developers around that. And in some cases, it does work where you have in a community, a company or a off-taker on which you can base almost a microgrid type of approach. So you effectively build a project around a community with a core off-taker, and you have the ability to use that as, in terms of security, in terms of payment. I don't want to go into all the detail, but I think, the short and long is you need DFI support, and a commercial bank will also always look at it through commercial lens at these type of projects. So it's a way of finding ways to mitigate the risk in your off-taker arrangement.
Well, thank you for that. I really do think it is actually very important that we promote these community-owned renewable energy projects, but I think it is a way of ensuring that the transition is truly a just one. And that everybody is involved, that the communities actually can own the assets and benefit from those assets. And there's a question for Mr. Mbele. This is from Lawrence Nyati. It says, from a regulatory point of view, how far are we as South Africa from enabling rapid bankable microgrid systems? Bearing in mind that local content involvement is massively hindered by skills development and designated groups focus finance.
We are advanced. I mean, there are ongoing discussions, specifically with ESCOM, on microgrids as part of solving the challenges that we have. Even from an electrification point of view, we are looking at microgrids as a possible solution, taking into account, obviously, the limitations that we have on the power generation side from a grid point of view. So there are advanced discussions, and yeah, so that's what I can indicate to Lawrence, that we are very advanced. It's something that we would want to obviously pursue from a government point of view.
Thank you. There is another question that has been answered already from Terence Peary, which speaks to traditional PPA arrangements require long-term commitments to make them bankable, and many potential off-takers are not able to commit to this. And the question was, are banks considering shorter-term financing structures? For me, I want to sort of branch off a little bit from that and ask, you know, at a municipal level, how do we ensure that we are able to comply with, for example, the PFMA and the Municipal Finance Management Act when we are looking at doing, you know, these PPA arrangements? Perhaps this could be a quick comment from both yourself, Rentia, and Dadenbed.
Jacob, I'll go first. I think it's a very important question, and I think there's a lot of work going into potentially frameworks to assist municipalities to navigate through the process. However, when we look at some of these RFPs being issued and some of the PPAs that many clients approach us with, you know, the first question we ask is, do you have confirmation of the PFMA process? And that's normally where, you know, one needs to confirm as part of the DD process. And then the second question is, allow us to comment on the PPA to ensure that it is in a bankable and acceptable form, not only for us as a funder, but also in terms of the clients we will support. So I'll leave it there. Over to you, Jacob.
Thanks, Naisha. From my side, I mean, the first point that I can indicate is that one of the things that we've done to enable generation within municipal space was to clarify the requirements for municipalities to apply for a Section 34 determination for minister, and for that Section 34 to go to NESA for concurrence. Recognizing some of the challenges that Rentia had, or some of the requirements that the banks have in terms of ensuring that there is PFMA approval and all that. I mean, one of the requirements that we have put in place is that municipalities must be able to produce some level of concept sort of a paper. What we had found in that concept paper clearly demonstrate that they have done the necessary financial analysis, and they've also followed the national treasury processes, you know, around triple Ps and all that. Because what we had found in the past is that municipalities are approached by a lot of obviously potential IPPs, and many of them they don't have sort of a clue where to start, and you end up with obviously proposals that end up with the banks that have got a lot of loopholes. So we have put a system in place from a department point of view as part of the Section 34 to make sure that when we issue Section 34, some of these boxes have been ticked. But I'm aware that there is also work that's happening at National Treasury under the GTEC, the triple P unit, where they are looking at frameworks and instruments to assist municipalities or help municipalities to be able to navigate some of the challenges that come with undertaking procurement or developing projects in this space. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have gone 15 minutes, I think, over what I had hoped we would do. but I think this conversation really could go on all afternoon. We do have one last follow-up question. Rencha, if you could answer this in 30 seconds. And it is taking into account our current wheeling framework in South Africa and the lack of flexibility. What sort of risk mitigation has the bank considered, particularly counterparty risk within a portfolio of takers?
Yeah, it's a valid question. Just in 30 seconds, I think the key thing for us is we want to see a blueprint framework of a wheeling agreement, confirmation of costs in any wheeling agreement. So that is absolutely critical for us, and to have the comfort that you can actually do that. And I think there are definitely positive examples. So a portfolio approach provides us with more comfort around ability to be able to assess the off-taker risk and the creditworthiness of the off-takers. We've mentioned many models, we've referenced many opportunities, but I'll be honest, as the market starts to open up and we see more clients coming to us with committed off-takers, this is a model that we believe will fly quite quickly, and we will find ways to fund that. So I'm quite excited about it, and I think the market is moving quickly. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I really want to thank you for your time. It's been a great conversation. For me, I think two key takeaways really from this, and that is one, we certainly have, you know, the policy and regulatory framework to make this happen. It sounds like from a financing perspective, there are options, and we are ready to get going. Yes, there will be technical challenges, as highlighted both by Gabrielle and Aradna, but the standards are in place, and we should be able to get moving. Yes, there is a challenge of skills, but this is something that we need to partner, as Rencha mentioned earlier, you know, the public sector and the private sector to ensure that we take this as an opportunity, actually. You know, we should look at this transition as an opportunity to create jobs. And what I love about the Australian example is that we can now point at a living example and say, look, this is how many jobs were created per kilowatt, you know, that was developed, obviously under these conditions. Yes, South Africa's conditions will be different, but I think, you know, this almost puts to bed the debate between you know, moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy that, you know, will have a bloodbath in terms of jobs. So I think this is something we need to look at very closely. Of course, we need to be pragmatic in our approach. You know, there's lots of communities, businesses that depend, you know, societies really that are built around you know, coal mining, and we can't simply switch off today. We need to be practical in our approach and pragmatic. But I think for me, the message is, let's just get down to it. Let's do it. It is possible. And yeah, once again, thank you so much to my panelists. And thank you to the audience as well. You know, I know it's in the middle of the day in South Africa, and of course, Gabrielle, can't thank you enough. You know, it's in the evening for you on a Friday evening, and you've taken time to come in and spend an hour odd with us. So thank you so much. And Adembele, I know you're a very busy man. We really do appreciate your time and government's input into this conversation. Gabrielle, sorry, not Gabrielle, Rencha, and you, Aradna, again, you're also, you know, truly appreciated. Thank you all so much. Oh, sorry, just before we close off, there's a question. Will the recording of the session be available to all of us after the meeting? I'm not able to answer that, Heinrich. I will have to check, because we did not specifically ask our panelists if, you know, they had any objections to the recording being available. Okay, I see Gabrielle says it's fine by her. And I think she's shared the presentation already, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so we'll see if we're able to share, we'll certainly share. So I'll have to speak to the panelists to make sure that there isn't anything sensitive, you know, that they wouldn't want being shared in a recording. Otherwise, thank you all. It was really a great pleasure. Enjoy your weekend. Cheers, everyone.